I'm Jane Dunnewold, and today I'm going to share some more ideas about using India ink in unexpected ways. In another video I filmed recently, I showed you how to put flour paste on fabric and wait for it to dry and crackle it, and then use the India ink, in this case, to create this beautiful crackle pattern. But I've got some other tricks up my sleeve, and I'd like to show those to you. But first, let's talk about the supplies that we need. Any fabric will work for these techniques that I'm showing you today. I've got a piece of cotton here. I've tried linen. I've worked on silk a lot in the past. Silk works really beautifully for this. Ideally, you would want a fabric that wasn't a really, really thin fabric, like, for example, a silk habitai or a cotton organdy, because the India ink will wick through that plain weave fabric so quickly you won't be able to control it that well, and you may not be able to get some of the patterning in quite the same way that I'm showing you that I got. So the fabric is an important consideration, and then it is important to get a real India ink. Someone commented in another video that the India ink she tried washed out. But if it's permanent India ink, and it should say that right on the labeling, you're good to go. It's not going anywhere. So this is a brand I like that's very affordable. You don't want to buy it in those tiny little bottles like this. It's going to kill you price-wise. So instead, this is Handy Art Black Velvet Waterproof India ink. And I buy this at Dick Blick, but I'm sure you can get it lots of different places. Okay, so I also add water to this, and I do that because I don't need it as highly concentrated as it is here, so it goes a really long way. So let me show you how I thin it down so that you'll be able to figure out that part of it for yourselves. Okay, so what I typically do is make different dilutions of the India ink. So I have a grayscale. I make some thinner versions with just, for example, a little ink in tap water, and I can get a little fabric and test that so that I can see how dark it's going to be. I can add more water to it, or I can add more ink to it. I already have a fairly concentrated amount mixed up in this old cottage cheese container, and I put it in the cottage cheese container so that I can wad up the fabric and dip it in there in order to apply it. But I keep these different solutions in bottles and I label them so that I know how strong they are. But you know, this is very stable and you can always change it. So if you started working with this variety right here and you wanted it to be a little bit lighter, you could pour half of it off and add more water to it. So it's pretty much endlessly repeating itself, and the bottle goes a long way. Now, I work inside a dishpan like this, and I wear gloves, and I'm going to show you how I do this in a second, but first I want to walk you through some samples. But it's really important to have the gloves because you do not want to stick your hands in there. I mean, I don't get my nails done, but if you did, it'd be a total disaster. So make sure, or you could work in a sink if you wanted to, but it does have a tendency to stain, which is why I have the dishpan and also this piece of vinyl that I work on whenever I use these techniques. Okay, so the first thing that I have played with is to work with the ink just as if I was doing tie-dye. And in a case like this, the way this was done, I pleated up the fabric, and then I pressed it with my iron so it was nice and flat and crisp, and then I fold it like this and I roll it up. And I have on my gloves, and then I would put a little India ink down in a fairly flat container like this lid, and I would just dip the edge ever so gently, both edges. Now, you don't want to overdo the amount of ink because it, as I said earlier, it will wick, but that's how I got this particular pattern. This was a little bit darker, but I didn't wait for it to dry completely before I rinsed it, so it did lose just a little bit of the color. If I wanted these to be darker lines, or I wanted them to actually be black, then I could work with the straight India ink and they would be black lines. I have another version of the cotton, and I used a very, very pale mixture of ink for this, so it's really beautiful and subtle. And the thing about this is that now that I have this finished, if I want a darker high contrast line, I could pleat this up again and dip it in straight ink, and then I'd have really, really dark lines against this gray background, and that would be beautiful too. The fabric does seem to play a role in how the ink is absorbed permanently. So this is an old piece of jacquard tablecloth, and it's beautiful, but it's very, very subtle. And I think it had something to do with the ink not adhering as well to this linen as it did to the cotton. Now they're both cellulose fibers, so I'm not quite sure why that is, but let's see. I'm not sure it matters which side is which either, but the point is that you may need to experiment with different fabrics that you have in order to be able to predict how well the fabric will take the color. I do know from working with the flower paste and silk so much that I can get really dark lines. This sample was slightly thinned, but I could get blacker lines, and silk is usually very reliable. Now, another technique that I used was along that same line. This is really beautiful and subtle too. And I did this by literally scrunching the fabric up and putting it in a baggie and then drizzling the India ink solution in on top of it and kind of squishing it around and opening it up. And it's pretty, but again, because it's the linen, it didn't stay as black as I thought it would stay. So that's still an experiment that's in progress. Another way to work with the ink is literally to have the plastic surface that I have here and take a brush and brush India ink solution right onto the vinyl, or drip it on. Lots of ways you can get it there. But once I got the ink on the vinyl, then I laid the piece of fabric down on top like this. So literally I was creating a monoprint. And this has a lot of potential. I love the way these are looking, mainly because they have so much potential to be used, cut up and incorporated. This would be beautiful as a path, for example, if I was making a landscape. So there's the monoprinting aspect of it. But there's one more technique that I discovered accidentally that blows the socks off of the rest of this stuff. Okay, so I've got on my gloves. Don't forget the gloves. And I've got my white fabric. I'm using the cotton. And I've got my ink. And I'm going to dip this fabric into the ink and squish it around so that I get it completely covered with ink. In this particular instance, I don't want any white space. I want all the white to be gone. Kind of wring it out. I'm going to open this up on my vinyl. You can see it's really black. Now, here's the interesting thing. I had a piece of fabric that had India ink on it in my studio for something else, and this is a long time ago now, so I don't remember what I was doing. But I accidentally placed, I think it was a couple of jars, over on the fabric, not realizing the fabric was wet, and just basically kind of being the space cadet that I'm capable of being. And when I came back the next day, I noticed that those were there, didn't think anything about it, moved them out of the way, and had the biggest surprise ever, which I still can't explain, but here's how it works. So right now this is wet, and I can take any number of things. I could take this plastic plate, I could use can lids of all kinds, plastic, metal, doesn't make any difference. I could use glass jars turned upside down. I can use gravel. This is crushed granite. The point is that while this fabric is still wet, I'm going to put this down right there on top of it. I could put down the can lids too if I wanted to, but in this case I'm just going to use this plate. And then I have to walk away and let this dry. And now I'm going to move this out of the way so I can show you what the results are. So this is what happens. I don't know why. I have no idea how it works. If you know why it works, please put it in the comments down below or email me, because I've been asking and I haven't found anyone who could really give me a definitive answer yet. But when you pick up that plastic plate and take it off of the dried fabric, you will find that no matter what you use, whether it's the can lids, here's a scarf I did with can lids and jars. It's beautiful, very subtle. Whether it's can lids, and this is silk, this is cotton, or in this case, this is that crushed granite. This would be great if I wanted to do a night sky. I don't think it's the pressure, because the can lids and that plastic plate weigh almost nothing. Of course, the crushed granite is a little bit heavier, or makes really good contact with the fabric, but I don't think it has anything to do with that. And I don't think it has anything to do with it, because here's a sample that I did, and in this particular case, the shapes that I used were literally construction paper, which weighs nothing. So the fabric is damp. I don't think it's wet enough to be absorbed into the construction paper, which can be used again and again. It's perfectly fine, but it's an interesting phenomenon. And all I know is that once these dry, then they can be hand washed. Now, I would not put this stuff with the India ink, I wouldn't put it into the washing machine, because I think that the washing machine, the prolonged cycling and the more vigorous cycling has a tendency to take out some of the ink. But you can certainly hand rinse these and use them. And if you're doing scarves, you wouldn't put a scarf like this in the washing machine anyway. You'd either dry clean it or you'd hand wash it and hang it to dry. So that is the surprising thing that can happen. And now I'm thinking, what about foam stamps, and what about plexiglass shapes, and what about leaves? As the botanical printer that I am, I can hardly wait to try this same effect with leaves, because it's not like a cyanotype. There isn't really any light involved in what's happening. It's some other chemical thing that has yet to be unraveled. Now, I do want to point out that this is a piece of the linen, the jacquard linen, and it had the can lids on it. And again, it's much fainter than the cotton and the silk. It's also beautiful. It would make a beautiful garment. And the fact that it's so light means that I can see the jacquard pattern in it, which is definitely an advantage. But you want to go back to this basic premise of testing the fabric before you get started. I hope this has been an exciting thing to see, because it sure has been exciting for me to experiment with it, and there's so much more to be done. So if you liked this, I hope that you will ring that bell, get some notifications. I hope that you will subscribe to my channel. And if you've got other questions and comments, I'm always here, and I'm eager to know what you think. So thanks for being here today.